At the center of the hotel lobby stood her, Madison Lockhart, CEO of Lockhart and Vale Investments. A woman who could tilt markets with a single email. Her red blazers screamed power. Her heels struck marble like gavel blows. People cleared a path for her without realizing they had. Madison wasn't used to being questioned, let alone ignored, which was why her jaw clenched now, her fingers tightening around the stem of a champagne flute. She hadn't even sipped. On the far side of the lobby, board members whispered. A scandal was brewing, one she was desperate to quash. Her engagement, the one splashed across glossy magazines and business journals, was unraveling in real time. Her fiancé hadn't shown up. Not to the press event. Not to the charity dinner. Not tonight. Madison Lockhart, America's iron-willed dealmaker, stood alone under a chandelier made for couples, and the vultures in tailored suits were circling. She swallowed her pride with the sharp edge of the champagne bubbles. Just 10 minutes, she muttered to herself. I need someone. Anyone. Her eyes darted, scanning the room not for investors or rivals, but for a lifeline. That's when she saw him. The waiter. He moved differently than the others in starched uniforms. While the others hustled with the nervous energy of staff, trying not to be noticed, he carried himself with deliberate calm. His tray balanced easily in one hand, his step steady, his posture grounded. He had the look of someone who had carried heavier loads before this job. Maybe the weight of a different kind of life. His name tag read, Daniel Brooks. He was 32, though the lines around his eyes made him seem older. His hands, broad, calloused, didn't belong in white gloves. His gaze lingered not on the wealthy guests, but on the clock above the elevators. As if somewhere else, someone was waiting on him. Daniel wasn't looking to be noticed. Not by her, not by anyone. But Madison Lockhart noticed everything. And desperation made her bold. She crossed the marble in 3 strides, stopping so close he could smell the faint mix of roses and steel that clung to her. The board members tracked her every move, whispering behind their glasses. If she stood alone much longer, the headlines would write themselves. CEO jilted in public. Pretend you love me, she whispered, her voice low, urgent, threaded with a command and a plea all at once. Then, sharper. Just for 10 minutes. Daniel blinked. The tray wobbled for the first time that night. He had no script for this. No training manual covered what to do. When one of the most powerful women in the city ordered you to love her. And yet, in the silence that stretched between them, something flickered, recognition. Maybe, of 2 people carrying burdens no one else could see. The lobby held its breath. Daniel's answer, when it came, would change everything. Before we dive into the story, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep telling more stories like this. Daniel Brooks was the kind of man most people overlooked. He wore the black vest and bow tie of the hotel's catering staff, blending in with 100 others who slipped through the lobby unnoticed. But his story didn't fit the uniform. Just 3 hours earlier, he had been standing in a dimly lit kitchen, packing a brown paper lunch for his daughter. Emma was 7, with bright curls that never stayed tied back and a stubborn way of asking questions he couldn't always answer. Tonight, he'd kissed the top of her head, told her he'd be home after midnight, and reminded her to listen to her aunt, who had agreed, once again, to watch her. He worked doubles whenever he could. Rent didn't pause for grief. And ever since Emma's mom had walked out 5 years ago, it had been Daniel against the world. He carried that weight in silence. No one at the hotel knew he used to frame houses before the company folded and left him jobless. No one knew the scar on his hand came from a roofing accident. To the guests in the lobby, he was just another nameless server. Across the room, Madison Lockhart radiated the opposite energy. She was the kind of woman people couldn't look away from. Powerful, flawless, controlled. Yet tonight, a thin crack ran through her armor. The missing fiancé was more than personal embarrassment. It was political. Her investors doubted her stability. Her rivals smelled blood. And her board members lingered like hawks waiting for the moment she faltered. One of them in particular, Richard Vale, her so-called partner in the company, was already leaning into whispers. His suit was perfect, his smile sharp, his eyes calculating. Richard had been waiting for this. He had always bristled under Madison's dominance. If tonight exposed her as weak or desperate, he would seize the opportunity. Not so untouchable anymore, Richard murmured to a colleague. Loud enough for Madison to notice. The cruelty wasn't hidden. Around them, the lobby filled with the quiet hypocrisy of wealth. Guests smiled too brightly, investors clinked glasses, and no one stepped forward to help the woman they all relied on. Not yet. Madison's isolation was part punishment, part entertainment. Daniel, tray in hand, felt the sting of it even before she approached him. He knew that look in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in Emma when she was small and afraid to be left alone. For all her power, Madison looked cornered. The injustice was sharp. Here was a woman everyone admired, suddenly abandoned when she needed the smallest kindness. And here he was, a man written off by everyone in the room, about to be pulled into a storm he never asked for. When she whispered those words, "Pretend you love me," the lobby seemed to tilt, fate pointing two broken lives toward collision. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stood frozen, the tray balanced in one hand, the weight of Madison's request pressing down heavier than the crystal glasses he carried. Pretend he loved her? In front of all these people? It was madness. But her eyes, sharp, pleading, almost breaking, told him this wasn't about madness. It was about survival. He gave the smallest nod. That was all she needed. Madison slid her hand through the crook of his arm as if she'd been doing it for years. The movement was graceful, practiced. A CEO trained to turn any situation into theater. To the crowd, it looked like she was simply joining her date late. The room shifted instantly. Whispers quieted. Faces turned. Daniel felt every stare like a hot light on his skin. He wasn't supposed to exist in their world, not like this. He was staff, background. Now, suddenly, he was the man at Madison Lockhart's side. Richard Vale noticed. His lips curled into something between disbelief and disgust. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered to the cluster of board members beside him. She dragged a waiter into this circus? A ripple of quiet laughter followed. Daniel heard it. Madison did too. But her grip on his arm only tightened. "Smile," she whispered through her teeth. Daniel forced one, awkward and stiff. He hated it already. But he hated the way Richard was looking at them more. Like Daniel was a stain on the carpet, something that didn't belong. "Madison," Richard called, his voice smooth but cutting. "Introduce us to your companion." The board members chuckled again. The word companion dripped with mockery. Madison didn't flinch. She tilted her chin higher, every inch the powerful executive. "This is Daniel," she said clearly, as if daring anyone to question it. Daniel gave a small nod, trying to keep his posture steady. His heart pounded. Every second he stood there, he risked everything. His job, his dignity. If management thought he was stepping out of line, he'd be gone before the night ended. And then what? Another job lost. Another scramble to keep a roof over Emma's head. Richard's smirk widened. "Daniel, interesting. I didn't realize you'd taken up with hotel staff, Madison. I suppose innovation shows up in strange places." The words landed like slaps. Around them, people exchanged looks. No one defended Daniel. No one stopped Richard. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He'd spent years being invisible. And now, when he was finally seen, it was as a punchline. He wanted to put the tray down and walk out, leave Madison to fight her own battles. But then he caught it again, the flicker in her eyes. Fear, hidden beneath steel. She needed him to stay. So he stayed. Madison turned slightly, her voice calm, but edged like glass. "Richard, you've always struggled to recognize value when it's right in front of you. That's why I lead the company, and you follow." Gasps rippled. A few board members coughed into their drinks, pretending not to smile. Richard's face darkened. Daniel stayed silent, his role unclear, but his presence undeniable. He wasn't sure what game he was playing. Only that walking away now would mean failure. For her, and maybe for himself too. The tension in the room thickened. Daniel could feel the invisible line drawn between him and the rest. He wasn't dressed right. He wasn't educated like them. Didn't have their money, their polish. He was a single dad in borrowed shoes, suddenly dragged into a stage he didn't belong on. Yet under all the discomfort, something stirred, a steadying force inside him. He'd spent years surviving situations tougher than this, carrying responsibilities that would crush most men. He didn't have wealth, but he had grit. And though no one in the lobby knew it yet, grit could be louder than money when the moment demanded it. For now, though, he kept it buried. The champagne glasses on his tray clinked quietly as his hand trembled. But his voice stayed low and steady when he whispered back to Madison, "I'll hold on." Just tell me what you need." Her eyes flicked to his, surprise flickering there for the briefest second. She hadn't expected loyalty from him. Not from a stranger. But the game was far from over. Richard wasn't done. And Daniel's borrowed role as Madison's companion was only going to get harder to play. The lobby buzzed around them, laughter and chatter returning in shallow waves. But Daniel's pulse was still a hammer in his ears. He could feel Richard's stare burning into him, waiting for him to slip. To confirm what everyone already assumed, that he didn't belong. Daniel kept his shoulders squared, but inside. His mind drifted, not forward into the danger of tonight, but backward. He wasn't always the man carrying trays. Years ago, before Emma, before the foreclosure, before the long string of jobs that didn't last, Daniel had worked construction by day and studied business management at night. He'd wanted more. He'd sat in classrooms with fluorescent lights, notebooks filled with numbers and strategy notes. He'd even been offered a chance at an internship with a development firm downtown, but then Emma's mom left, and with one final slammed door, all those plans had gone with her. Daniel hadn't had the luxury of chasing dreams. He'd had diapers to buy, bills stacked on the counter, a baby who cried until he held her. That was the only degree he'd earned, fatherhood, with honors and sacrifice. And yet, the knowledge hadn't vanished. It lived inside him, buried under years of exhaustion. Sometimes it surfaced when he helped Emma with her math homework, or when he read the business section of the paper while waiting for the bus. He'd look at the stock charts, the property listings, the growth forecasts, and feel a strange ache. He still understood it. He still cared. Tonight, as he stood beside Madison, he felt that part of himself stirring again. Richard's voice cut across the room, bragging about quarterly returns, spinning numbers that were technically true but deliberately misleading. Daniel caught the twist immediately, the kind of smoke and mirrors trick he'd studied once upon a time. His jaw clenched. He could have exposed it in a second. But who would listen to him here? A waiter? He stayed silent. Still, Madison's glance toward him lingered. She didn't know his story, but something in his posture must have betrayed that he wasn't as simple as he seemed. She had asked for a performance, but what she got was a man who carried himself like he had weathered storms. Bigger than this lobby. Daniel's mind flickered again to Emma, to her wide eyes when she asked if they'd ever live in a big house with stairs, like the one she saw on TV. He'd smiled and told her maybe, someday. He couldn't give her that house tonight, but he could keep this job, this fragile lifeline, if he played along and didn't get thrown out. He swallowed the words he could have said, the truth he could have revealed. This wasn't the time. Not yet. Instead, he steadied the tray in his hand and whispered under his breath, too soft for anyone but Madison to hear, "I've stood in worse storms." She looked at him puzzled, as if she knew there was more to him than the suit and tray suggested. And for the first time all night, her shoulders eased just slightly. The secret of Daniel Brooks had not yet been told, but the night was far from over. The night reached a boiling point when Richard Vale clinked his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying like a polished showman, "before we toast, I think it's only fair that Madison's partner say a few words. After all, anyone who stands at her side must have something worth sharing." The crowd chuckled. It was bait wrapped in silk, a trap designed to humiliate. Madison stiffened beside Daniel. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Richard was already waving his glass, calling for silence. Daniel's throat dried. He hadn't signed up for this. Pretending was one thing. Speaking to a room full of power brokers was another. If he said nothing, Madison would look weak. If he said the wrong thing, he'd embarrass them both and probably lose his job before the night was over. The board members leaned forward, smirks tugging their lips. They wanted blood. Madison whispered, almost too soft to hear, "You don't have to." But Daniel surprised himself. He stepped forward. "I'll say something," he said. The room fell still. The waiter was going to speak. Daniel set the tray down on a side table and straightened. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit, but his presence shifted, calm, deliberate, steady. Years of carrying weight heavier than glasses or trays pressed into this moment. "I'm Daniel," he began simply. "I don't belong in this world of numbers and suits. At least not the way most of you do. I work with my hands. I serve drinks. I go home late at night and pack lunches for my daughter in the morning. That's who I am." A few titters of laughter rose, until Daniel's voice hardened. "But I know when someone's lying with numbers. And I know when someone's trying to humiliate another person to make themselves look strong. The laughter died. Richard's smile thinned. Daniel continued, steady as a metronome. Mr. Vale was talking earlier about quarterly returns, bragging about record profits. What he didn't mention was the company's debt-to-equity ratio, which is climbing, or the fact that those profits came from cutting workers, not growth. That's not strength. That's stripping a house for lumber and calling it new construction. Gasps rippled. Heads swiveled back to Richard. Daniel didn't stop. I used to frame houses. I know what happens when you cut corners. The whole thing looks fine until the foundation starts to buckle. Then it all comes down. He let his words hang heavy in the chandelier-lit air. A murmur swept through the lobby. Investors looked at each other, startled. Richard's face flushed red. You, Richard sputtered, his polished veneer cracking. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a waiter. Daniel finished for him, calm but sharp. Maybe. But sometimes the ones carrying trays see more than the ones carrying briefcases. The silence was thunderous. No one laughed now. Madison's lips curved, just slightly, into the first true smile of the night. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, cleared his throat. He's right, he said reluctantly. The numbers don't add up. I've been saying the same thing for months. Others nodded, murmuring in agreement. Suddenly, Richard wasn't in control of the room anymore. Daniel stepped back beside Madison, pulse racing, but his face calm. He'd done what no one expected. He had turned their laughter into silence, their dismissal into attention. Richard tried to rally. This is absurd. You're all listening to a server. But Madison cut him off. Her voice cool and commanding. A man who speaks the truth deserves to be heard, no matter what uniform he wears. Daniel saw what you try to hide because he hasn't forgotten what honesty looks like. Her words landed like a gavel. The power in the room shifted. Madison wasn't the isolated, abandoned woman anymore. She had an ally. Unexpected, unpolished, but undeniably strong. Richard, for the first time, looked small. The crowd erupted in whispers. Some were shocked, others impressed, and a few simply stunned that a hotel waiter had dismantled a corporate shark in front of them. Daniel exhaled slowly. His hands still trembled, but his voice had not. For once, he wasn't invisible. And the lobby, that glittering arena of wealth and ego, would never forget what they had just seen. The shock in the lobby hung like a storm cloud. Glasses sat untouched, whispers buzzed like bees. And all eyes flicked between Madison, Richard, and the man who wasn't supposed to matter, Daniel Brooks. Richard's composure cracked fully. His face was blotched with red, his words stumbling. This is ridiculous. You can't just take his side. He's nobody. But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. One board member folded his arms. Daniel's not wrong. We've all noticed the layoffs, the padding of numbers. You said nothing. Richard, you laughed. You called it strategy. Another chimed in, her tone sharper. If a hotel waiter can spot flaws in your report, what does that say about your leadership? The room hummed with agreement. Richard's power slipped through his fingers like sand. Madison, standing tall, let the silence linger before speaking. Her voice was measured, steady, every word deliberate. What it says, she said, her gaze pinning Richard, is that arrogance makes us blind. And blindness has no place in leadership. A pause, then a single, scattered clap. Then another. Within moments, the room was filled with applause. Not thunderous, but firm. Steady. Approval. Daniel felt heat rise in his face. Applause wasn't something he was used to. He wanted to shrink back, to melt into the marble floor. But Madison squeezed his arm lightly, grounding him. Richard tried to salvage his dignity, muttering something about misinterpretations and context, but the damage was done. The board members' faces were set. His allies had gone quiet. His career wasn't just bruised, it was bleeding out. Madison turned to Daniel. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. So only he could hear. I know, Daniel replied. But somebody had to. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but with respect. The kind she rarely gave, the kind he hadn't felt in years. By the time the night ended, Richard had slipped out a side door, avoiding the stairs. Word would spread quickly. The board was preparing a vote of no confidence. His arrogance had finally met its end. But Daniel's night wasn't over. As the guests began to file out, more than a few stopped to shake his hand. Some thanked him for his courage. A few even asked his last name, like it mattered now. For once, he wasn't invisible. Later, in the quiet corner of the lobby, Madison faced him fully. The crowd had thinned, the music dimmed. For the first time all evening, she looked human, tired, relieved, almost vulnerable. "You know, you could have stood there and let me drown," she said. "But you didn't. You spoke like someone who's carried responsibility before." Daniel shifted awkwardly. "I've carried more than trays," he admitted. "But I don't have a resume anyone in your world would care about." Madison tilted her head. "You think I built this company by only looking at resumes? No. I built it by recognizing people who see what others miss. And you, Daniel Brooks, saw exactly what I needed tonight." He blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Come to my office Monday," she said. "Not as a waiter. As someone I want on my team." The words landed heavy. A chance. A door cracked open where before there had only been walls. Daniel thought of Emma, her curls, her questions, her dream of a house with stairs. He swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said, voice low but steady. Madison smiled, the kind that carried both gratitude and promise. "No, Daniel. Thank you." The story didn't end in that glittering lobby. By the next week, Richard's name was stripped from the company's letterhead, his reputation dragged by headlines. Madison held her ground, stronger for having been seen standing beside someone who wasn't born into her world. And Daniel? He walked Emma to school with a lighter step, knowing for the first time in years that tomorrow might be brighter than today. The applause from that night still echoed in his memory, not because it made him important, but because it proved something he had almost forgotten. Sometimes the quiet ones carry the strongest truths, and when they finally speak, the whole world has to listen. 2 years later, the hotel lobby where it all began looked different to Daniel. He wasn't carrying a tray anymore. He walked through the marble floors in a suit that actually fit. His ID badge clipped neatly to his chest. Director of Community Development, Lockhart and Vale. The company had changed too. Madison had made good on her promise. Not only hiring Daniel, but listening to him. Together, they had built a program that invested in small neighborhoods, giving contracts to local builders, offering training for single parents who needed stable work, and creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked, just like Daniel once was. And Daniel thrived. He wasn't just earning a paycheck anymore, he was building something that mattered. Every week, he went home to Emma with stories of new projects, of families moving into homes with real stairs, of parents who finally had steady work. Emma, now 9, would listen wide-eyed, proud that her dad wasn't invisible to the world anymore. Richard Vale, on the other hand, had vanished from the boardroom headlines. After the scandal, no major company would touch him. Last Daniel had heard, Richard was consulting for small firms. His arrogance now a shadow of what it once was. He was a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles, proof that power without integrity eventually collapses. One evening, standing in his new office overlooking the city, Daniel thought about that night under the chandelier. The moment Madison had grabbed his arm. The moment he had chosen to step forward, even though everything in him wanted to disappear. That single choice had shifted his life forever. He realized something then. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence, hidden behind tired eyes and calloused hands, until the world finally calls it out. And when it does, it can rebuild what others have broken. Daniel had become more than a man with a second chance. He had become a reminder that dignity belongs to everyone. Waiter or CEO, builder or board member. The applause that once embarrassed him had turned into something greater, a legacy of change, brick by brick, life by life. Sometimes our greatest enemies help us discover our true strength. True justice doesn't destroy, it rebuilds what others failed to recognize. If this story inspired you, subscribe and share it. Somewhere out there, another Daniel is waiting to be seen. And your voice might be the spark that helps them step into the light.